Hello and welcome to this first part of a brief introduction to early Irish myth and culture. I've entitled these three presentations Sex, Death, and the Spirit World, just because it kind of sums the whole thing up, really. The idea here is to just provide you with a very, very brief, but a little more than superficial introduction to the world of early Irish literature, the scéalta tradition that goes back to the early Middle Ages, back easily into the 6th century, most likely much, much earlier than that, and then continued right up until English culture really started to eclipse Gaelic culture in Ireland in the late 16th and then throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The first thing that I'd like to say, though, is that in reading these early Irish tales, you really need to be careful. And so in each of these presentations, I'm going to start with a caveat lector, let the reader beware. And the first thing that I'd like to point out is that the world of the tales does not equal historical reality. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. A lot of scholars have made this mistake as well. And the mistake really is that you think that when you read stories about Cuchulainn and Mav, and you read stories about like Finn McCool and all these guys, that it actually is a literal reflection of what society was like, and you just can't make that assumption. The social structure represented is nominal and not real. Pre-Christian revenants may be artificial, and gender roles may have been tweaked because all of these stories are written down by later Christian monks and don't reflect the pre-Christian world that it seems to transmit so transparently. It would be like, imagine if the only stories from modern English culture were like, stories about, the 007 movies or, Marvel's Avengers and things like that. You just can't really, it does say very important things about our society, but it's not necessarily a historical representation. Even when you have history represented in these texts, historical figures like Niall Gelach and other figures, particularly saints, you have to appreciate that these are literary reflections and not sort of a window into the past, as sometimes they're interpreted. And the other thing that sort of comes out of this is that you need to be careful of your own blind spots and preconceptions. That is to say, you have to be aware that you bring your own expectations to these tales when you read them. And one of the most prevalent preconceptions that we have is this notion of the Celtic twilight that has been advanced since W.B. Yeats really wrote all of his stuff, and it gets continued with artists like Lorena McKennitt and Enya, and this sort of the pale Celtic woman pining away in the mists for a world that has gone, and this kind of a business. That when you get into the real stories, that sort of element is not quite as prevalent. So what are the primary topics that we're going to be dealing with in these presentations? First of all, after I deal a little bit with history and context, I want to talk about aspects of social structure, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. The next presentation, I want to talk about some religious elements, particularly pre-Christian religious elements that seem to have survived in these tales, and how the Christian culture that records them has impacted these. And then I want to talk in the final presentation, I want to talk about some cultural perspectives and practices, and also some literary tropes that get used, because a lot of times the stories can present situations that just seem really strange and bizarre, and you have to understand that those are really coming out of some literary tropes that get deployed very often. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about context. The world we're talking about in this literary world is, of course, the North Sea in medieval Europe, and really this is coming out of the world between about 400 and 1000 AD, early medieval Europe. That's the sort of origin of the stories that we're looking at. Many of these stories don't get recorded until after this period in the High and Late Middle Ages. Most of the stories that come down to us, for example, get recorded in manuscripts of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Some of them don't even exist in manuscripts until as late as the 17th and 18th centuries. But because of the language that they're being recorded in, we know that they go back to this early medieval period, the period of Old Irish. Culturally speaking, if we're to put it onto a map, what we're really talking about is coming out of this area, which is the Goidelic speaking world, the world that gives us Scottish Gaelic, it gives us Manx, it gives us modern Irish, and then of course close to it is the Brittonic speaking area, which gives us Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, and the sort of the formative historical moment that sort of kicks off the world that gets recorded in these literatures is the impingement on this Atlantic Celtic world by the Norse and West Germanic cultures. Of course, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of the 4th and 5th centuries, the Viking expansion that occurs in the late 8th and 9th centuries. These begin to sort of these begin to affect Goidelic and Celtic culture in general, and then set the stage for the kinds of tales that are being told. This impingement can be seen as a continuation of what's sometimes called the Age of Migrations, Germanic migrations, that goes all the way back into the 3rd century and gives us really the medieval and modern map of Europe. The reason why you have the French in France is because the Franks settled there. We're not going to spend too much time with that, but there's one other thing that I want to point out here is that even though you have these migrations and this sort of Germanic incursion that leads to a notion of a kind of embattled Celtic culture, the world of the Cogu Gael Regalav, the battle of the Gael against the foreigners, there's a deeper history at work here too that goes back beyond the historical period that you see beginning with the classical world, and this period stretches back into that period from 1200 BC to about 100 AD, and that's the period that you see a continental Celtic culture across all of Europe. That Celtic culture actually was one of the foundational cultures in Europe, and of course, coeval with continental Celtic culture is the Nordic culture that is going on from about 500 BC to about 800 AD. And this eventually, then after 800 AD, this is what expands out in the Viking world. These two cultures coexisted for this massive amount of time, and go right the way back to an age when they were basically the same culture. If you go back to about 2000, 2500 BC or thereabouts, it's hard to tell exactly when the split occurred. Celtic and Germanic culture started out as a single culture that then split, and so you see a lot of deep similarities in these two cultures. And then, of course, what scholars have seen is that you have this sort of Atlantic fringe, which is not identical with continental Celtic culture, but it is living in a continuum with it. And across that very porous border between the Atlantic fringe and the Nordic culture in the north, you get a lot of exchanges. So it's a very, very complex, fluid world that we're really talking about prior to the early medieval world of the scéalta. So that's our context, and you'll see some of these themes and ideas playing out as we go through this. So for social structure, the topics I want to talk about are the concept of nobility, the concept of the aesthana, the people of skill, the idea of a warrior class, the idea of a literary or educated class, which includes poets, druids, and saints, very, very important to this early Gaelic culture. And then the fianna, who occupy a place kind of outside this social matrix. So these are the different branches of society that I really want to talk about here. And first of all, we're going to talk about the nobility. And really what you need to know about this nobility is that it is fundamentally hierarchical in its structure. That is to say, you have the ardri at the top of society who basically whose reach extends over the entirety of Ireland and even beyond, and then right the way down to the basic floy, the sort of ri at the most fundamental level of society, which was the tuath, and the tuath is the could be basically a group of related families. So you're talking about a group, a society in a tuath that's only about maybe 3 or 4 to 800 people at the most basic level. But then the individual who's the Ri or the king of that area then can look up to the Ri who is not only the Ri of his own tuath but also the Ri for both of the tuatha. So you get this hierarchical structure that sort of nests kings going all the way up. The concept of nobility in Gaelic culture is economic in its basis. That is to say, when you look at the old Irish law tracts, the Brehon laws, what you see is an emphasis on cattle, and cattle represent wealth. And in order to, by the time you get into the, once you get after about 700, you see the law tracts being written down, and they detail that, to be a king at the most basic level of the Tua over this sort of small group of related families, you have to have 20 cattle, 6 horses, and 6 pigs, because that's how much wealth you need in order to guarantee abundance for everybody. And just like Germanic culture, the purpose of a king is to provide abundance for the people that look up to him, or in Gaelic culture, her. So so nobility is economic in its fundamental basis. It's also focused on personal quality. So when you look at, if you're familiar with the rather amusing film Excalibur from the early '80s by John Boorman, Merlin says to Arthur, Arthur asks, "What does it mean to be king?" And Merlin answers, "You will be the land, and the land will be you. As you thrive, the land will flourish. As you fail, the land shall die." And this is really a very, very Gaelic concept, the idea that your own personal quality, how good of a person, how strong you are, is then reflected in the abundance of the land itself. So a king had to be true in the Gaelic sense of truth, and that was expressed in an idea of the fear flahavan, the truth of lordship. And this meant that it wasn't just telling the truth or living up to your word. That was certainly part of it, but it was also, fear flahavan was expressed through success on the battlefield. A true king does not lose battles. A true king wins battles. A true king is also quite beautiful and attractive. A true king doesn't have blemishes all over his face. A true king has the use of both eyes, has all 4 limbs well formed. So it's expressed in the quality of the person, him or herself. And finally, the ability to realize abundance for the people was seen as a kind of divine quality. And so the king, the Ri of a tuath, had almost a priestly function. The Ard Ri, the high king, was conceived of as being someone who married the land itself, expressed through a sovereignty goddess, a personification of the land. And through their fertile union, the fertility of the soil itself was guaranteed. So this sort of divine function of the king is a very, very, very old, and you see it coming out in the medieval literature of the period in a great many different ways. Now, people of skill, the scéalta, or the caird, as they might be termed, these are not just craftsmen, but also poets and performers. So in other words, if you have a significant skill that adds to society, then you're considered a member of this class. And just as kings were seen as being semi-divine, the skill that artisans possessed was seen as having a divine origin, as being an alcoholic drink brewed in the other world, to which the artisan was uniquely party. And in the cosmology of this Gaelic world, this led to a kind of a perception that reality itself is infinitely fluid. So a person of skill, the scéalta, were able to look past appearances, to manipulate reality in a very kind of magical way. And so this kind of leads to a perception of magic being everywhere, that everything has this kind of luminous quality to it. And this was shared in the warrior class. Warriors were considered to be poets as much as warriors. And in the literature, you see Cuchulainn combating Ferdiad as much through his poetry as with his swords. And we'll see that being reflected in some of the literary tropes that we see uh, in the third presentation. Now, this the warrior class was directly dependent on the nobility, just as the people of skill, the scéalta, were also dependent upon the nobility. So the rí, the fleadh in Ireland were seen as being this sort of font of abundance that then spilled out and allowed for the people of skill and the warriors to perform their very, very important functions. The warriors ensuring that the cattle were protected, that the people were protected, the people of skill providing the means of life in their respective areas, and then the rí sort of giving everybody the opportunity to grow and thrive. And at the top of the heap of these people of skill that both included the warriors and the artisans were the poets, the druids, and once Christianity took over, the saints. And what you see is that the poets had a kind of power of reality. That was the perception through their poetry. When we think of poetry today, we think of something which is a personal expression, which is intensely emotional, which is not overly rational, and therefore doesn't really take a part in reality. And so, in other words, poets are somehow disconnected from reality. The exact opposite was true in Gaelic culture. Poets were so clued into reality that they could change reality by virtue of their poetry, and that's something we'll look at more in an upcoming presentation. We look at the force of poetry. It took up to 20 years to train a poet, and in that training, poets would often specialize either in legal advice or in the sort of lore masters that were attached to a king. These are the bards that maintained the genealogical and historical lore of a given group. Or they could just be what's called a fianna. And a fianna is a sort of high poet that is sort of a master of all the poetic arts. And in this poetic perception of reality, the literary landscape was absolutely vast. The poetic tracts that record this literary landscape record that they had 365 meters, which matched 365 medicinal herbs and matched the 365 bones of the body. And of course, what you see in this is that knowledge created resonating connections with different types of knowledge. We would separate out medicinal knowledge into one branch, literary knowledge into another branch, botanical knowledge into another branch. But in the Gaelic imagination, all these different branches of knowledge were unified with poetic knowledge through poetic inspiration. And so the 365 meters, herbs and bones, of course, relate to the annual pattern of the year. We don't have time to really get into how they drew those comparisons across these different boundaries of knowledge, but it got quite elaborate throughout the Middle Ages. And then, of course, what that eventually leads to is a notion of specific genres when it comes to tales. So what you see happening here in the literary landscape of Ireland during the Middle Ages is you see a conception of knowledge that is ultimately reaching out into disparate areas of knowledge and drawing them all together, being able to build connections. And that's really what they saw knowledge as doing, was building connections between things. And of course, this eventually turned into a notion of knowledge forming social bonds in the same way that a king would dispense cattle in order to build the connections in society. The poet would dispense knowledge to build connections between people as well. So this was the basic conception of poetry. Now, the fianna are something entirely different. The fianna are fundamentally outside of the social system. In early Irish society, there was a time between when a person took up weapons and when they could take up their place in society, a sort of late adolescence, early adulthood. And in that time period, they would often go out and join one of the fian bands, one of the fianna. And these fian bands would live basically as brigands. It was a kind of sanctioned gang culture, really. And they would go out into the wilds and they would live in the wilds and live by their wits and their own inspiration. So it was populated by youth in transition. They're transitioning from childhood, when they're dependent on their parents, into adulthood when they take up their independent place in society as part of their families and whatnot. So it's youth in transition. And because they're in transition and because they are not really in society, but they're not truly wild, they're going to come back in, they're in a liminal state. Now, the term liminal is something that you're going to hear a lot of if you get into Celtic studies. So it's worth describing that a little bit. To be liminal is to occupy a place, not in one place or another place. It comes from the Latin word limen, which is the word for a door, for the door frame. So when you cross the limen of a door, you're going from one room into another. If you are in that liminal space, you're occupying a space which is neither in the room nor out of the room. You're in the door, you're liminal. And you see this coming out again and again in different places. So because the fianna were liminal, they were neither in society nor out of society. They were neither in youth nor in adulthood. They were neither in the wilds nor in settled communities. Because they were in this liminal space, they occupied a space of permanent fluidity. And that permanent fluidity gave them access to states of being and states of mind that other people didn't. And so the fianna were considered, for example, to have the ability to heal, the ability to gain access to knowledge that otherwise was prevented from people, and to gain access to social functions that other people didn't have. So this is something that's worth looking at, especially if you read the stories of Finn McCool. You have to understand that Finn McCool, as the archetypal leader of a fian band, it represents the fianna in its whole nature. So that's basically the structure of that's the social structure of early Ireland. And so in the next presentation, we'll get on to some religious elements.